So just a few brief words about today's training. So the idea was born very much out of this idea of looking at different disciplines to tackle online disinformation, but also the need to ground disinformation studies increasingly in history, society, and culture. And as many of you may know, there's a growing field, especially in the US, of critical disinformation studies, which call for the field to be more conscious of its historical conceptual predecessors, including mass communication and propaganda studies, but also slightly criticizing the ahistoricism of the field and the importance of taking a historical and contextual view to disinformation. So the idea of today's training was very much born out of this context, but today we will be looking at conspiracy theories as deep-seated cultural patterns, and here I will say no more because, of course, this is the field of expertise of our trainers. But just to leave you with a quote from those who are in this sense critical: history is often uncomfortable or challenging, and it rarely offers easy answers to policy questions, but it can expand our imagination and point out where problems require deeper, more structural intervention. So I very much hope today's training can help us inform our efforts to tackle disinformation. So just to introduce our excellent trainers for today: Nicolas Guilhot, who's a professor of intellectual history at the European University Institute, and Michael Butter, who's professor of American literary and cultural history since 2014 at the University of Tübingen. So I will stop sharing my screen and not take up any more of your time, as time is tight, and hand over to Nicolas. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and welcome to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to the EDMO organizers and to Lisa for the opportunity to speak today. Let me, before moving into my talk, do this little operation of screen sharing, which sometimes can go wrong, but it shouldn't. There you go. And can everyone see my screen? Okay.
It's perfect.
Very well. Okay, so thanks again to Lisa, and I'm doubly grateful, Lisa, because you actually started with a disclaimer I was about to make about both the topic of today and also the discipline I represent. It is my understanding that EDMO focuses, generally speaking, on disinformation in general. And while I will be talking about a much more narrow instance of disinformation, namely conspiracy theories. A second disclaimer I have to make that's very much in the wake of what Lisa said is that I will not only talk about a narrow instance of disinformation, but I'm not sure I can offer a technical advice, let alone a miracle solution to really fight off definitely conspiracy theories. But what I would like to do with you today is maybe take a long-term perspective on what our current thinking about conspiracy theories is, try to figure out how we came to view conspiracy theories as a problem, because it was not always the case, and also what kind of problem it is for us. So I want to start, however, by the end, namely by giving you a very quick and rough idea of what the current thinking about conspiracy theory is, which will be familiar to all of us. And to do this, I've chosen one picture, which is, I think, quite cogent. You obviously recognize the scene. This is the insurrection of January 6, 2021. And the main character here is the famous so-called Q shaman. His real name is Jacob Chansley. And I think it captures really what we understand to be the problem of conspiracy theories. Chansley, as all of you, I suppose, know, was and still is a supporter of QAnon. QAnon being a conspiracy theory according to which the world, I mean the US government, but the world in general, is ruled by a shadowy cabal of liberal globalists who actually are in reality an evil bunch of pedophiles and a group against which Trump was allegedly waging a secret war within the institutions, hence the decision to deprive him of his victory. Therefore, we have January 6th. And I think this picture illustrates two assumptions that we generally embrace about conspiracy theories. The first one is that belief in conspiracy theories is dangerous because it leads to real conspiracies. So there's a kind of weird mechanism of spilling over of ideas into reality. People who believe that they are fighting against or persecuted by powerful and invisible enemies organized in a secretive, shadowy way will tend to organize themselves in a symmetric fashion and collude and conspire. And therefore you have actual real conspiracies. So that's the first assumption we hold to be true. And it follows from that, that's a second assumption, that if we want to avoid this spillover, we have to block that mechanism and refute conspiracy theories before they spill over. And therefore, it's a problem essentially of refutation, a problem of knowledge, a problem of cognition. We look at conspiracy theories as a wrong way of thinking about the world and a wrong way of thinking about society or about history. And because it's a cognitive issue, then we have to intervene at that level. It's a matter of maybe better crafting the information people have access to, or it can be a matter of some sort of educational intervention. We have to re-educate or teach people to think better about the world, or we have to intervene into the informational ecosystem to make sure they get good information as opposed to bad information. So the idea is to oppose facts to conspiracy theories, and we really do consider conspiracy theories as theories. That is something that is susceptible to be true or false. We treat them very much the way we treat scientific theories, for instance, or historical accounts, as something that is adjudicated in terms of falsehood or truth. Now, the assumption, and that will be one of my main points today that I want to make, that conspiracy theories are a flawed form of knowledge about society is a very recent assumption, and it can be dated with precision, and I'll get to that a bit later in my talk, to the immediate years following World War II. And in that sense, at the scale of history, it's a very recent idea. So what I want to do is understand how we came to embrace these two assumptions, and perhaps ask whether there aren't other ways to think about conspiracy theories beyond the divide between facts and fictions or truth and falsehood that may help us maybe address better the sort of problems they create. Now, what can a historical approach do for you? I don't see my role as selling you the value of history, but much more simply, I want to make the case that thinking about conspiracy theories historically is not an option, simply because history invites itself to the discussion whether we like it or not. And I want to start with that. Now, this was January 6th, and you probably know that in the wake of January 6th, the Congress established a committee, the January 6th House Select Committee, to investigate the events of that day. And one of the most prominent figures in that committee is the representative from Maryland. That's him here on the left. His name is Jamie Raskin. He's a lawyer by training. He's a Democrat. He had a very prominent role in the crafting of the final report of the committee that was released not very long ago, a few weeks ago, actually last month, I think, late December. And the picture on the right is still a picture of Jamie Raskin. Now, it's not a fake. I know you're very sensitive to fake, and you are training about fake and fake pictures and fake videos. This is actually coming from a reliable news agency. It's Jamie Raskin. And I want to draw your attention to the book he's holding. You may not see it very well, but here's a bigger version of the book. The title is How to Stop a Conspiracy, an Ancient Guide to Saving a Republic, but it's not the original title. The original title is The War Against Catiline by the Roman historian Sallust. This is a recent, actually very modern, very vibrant, very engaging translation that was published last year by Princeton University Press, and obviously that caters to the anxieties of the moment by changing the title for something much more commercially catchy, How to Stop a Conspiracy. And when the journalist who took the picture asked Raskin why he was reading this, his answer was, I get ideas from wherever I can. So you see, you really have history is present in a massive way in the way we think about and we fight against conspiracy theories. Now, I want to say a few things about this book because it serves my purpose today well. The War Against Catiline by Sallust is probably one of the first, maybe the first historical account of an actually existing conspiracy we have, at least in Western culture. It's a very important book. For those of you who have not dabbed into it recently, I think that's most of us, me included, the summary, here's a quick summary. Catiline was a morally corrupt yet charismatic figure who in the mid-first century BC refused to concede defeat at the ballot box. He was a member of the Roman oligarchy, but he was burdened with debt. He surrounded himself with a cast of dodgy characters, including the occasional prostitute. He fomented riots, and he assembled the mob that threatened to march on the Capitol and burn the Senate. Now, it is indeed a case of history repeating itself, and you can see why someone like Jamie Raskin would look into Sallust while working on the January 6th committee. Now, Sallust was a historian, and he wrote about a real conspiracy. And now you might ask me, what has it got to do with conspiracy theories? And that's where I would like to get at. We all agree, I think, that real conspiracies are something that is historically documented and that they can be easily distinguished on the factual evidence base from conspiracy theories, which are crackpot fictions. And I assume this is axiomatic for most of us. And it's indeed a distinction that is the basis of all sort of debunking activities. But if we look closer at real conspiracies, historically existing conspiracies, such as Catiline's conspiracy, we quickly realize that things are much less clear-cut. Now, if you take Sallust, he was indeed a historian, and he claimed to write without bias, in his own words, with a mind free of political partisanship. And so what matters was the facts and only the facts. However, he was also a former politician whose career had been cut short because he was accused of embezzlement. He was a supporter of Caesar and therefore had a vested interest in undermining the most radical wing of the popular movement, which Caesar tended to capture and mobilize. Not only that, but we know for a fact that not everything in this book is true. In particular, he invented the first conspiracy that didn't exist only to make the point that Catiline was a criminal mind bent on conspiring from the very outset. So he tinkered with chronology. He reported hearsay, and if not malicious gossip at times. The result is that we'll never know for sure whether Catiline, before indeed opting for an insurrectional strategy in 63, if I'm not mistaken, and this he did, before that, we'll never know for sure whether he was actually a criminal mind, as Sallust is telling us, or simply a populist politician who was not welcome by the Roman senatorial oligarchy. So what I'm getting at here is that no matter how real and true the events were, what we have here is, however, a story in which these events are organized according to a certain pattern. And that's something I want to insist on for a little bit, is that there's a huge rhetorical dimension to the way these real events are narrated. So much so that for a very long amount of time, until the very early 18th century, that's 1800 years, Sallust was a model to be imitated if you had to write about real conspiracies. Every historical account of a conspiracy had to imitate Sallust. I'll just give you one example. So I'm joining you from Florence, and there is in the Florentine history a famous conspiracy that took place downtown in the Duomo, the Pazzi conspiracy, la Congiura dei Pazzi. The story is very simple. It's the Pazzi, which was a rival family to the Medici, and some of them attempted to kill Lorenzo de' Medici during Mass on a Sunday, on an Easter Sunday. They failed. They managed to kill his brother Giuliano, and Lorenzo escaped, and there was a massive backlash against the Pazzi family. But it happened in 1478. We do have eyewitness accounts, things that are highly reliable, of the actual attack of the conspiracy. And one of them was penned straight after the fact by the humanist scholar Angelo Poliziano. And yet, if you read it, it's partly inaccurate, in particular the physical descriptions of the attackers, whom he saw with his own eyes. He was really on the front lines. And they're not accurate because they're actually copies or plagiarizing or cut and paste, if you want, of Sallust's description of Catiline. I mean, literally line by line, adjective by adjective. So here, what you have is a real conspiracy that described in terms that actually are rhetorical convention. It's not that it's false, but it's a conspiracy precisely because Poliziano, the author of that account, follows a pattern, a narrative pattern that's fixed and that you cannot tinker with. And this is what I would like, the first point I want to make today is that what makes a certain event a conspiracy is it's not just a set of facts, it's a narrative template in which you have to set these facts. And this template exists before. And for a long time, it's perfectly legitimate to describe historical events in this highly rhetorical way. In fact, it's what makes them understood as conspiracies. Otherwise, it's unclear what it is. It could be a failed revolution, it could be something else. If you want to make it a conspiracy, there's this very strong moral load, there's this front loading of a moral quality of whoever is at the center of the action, and so on and so forth. So conspiracy, they're not just facts, they're not something that exists per se out there. They're a certain characterization of facts, including historical ones. So let me restate this maybe in a more provocative fashion. There are no conspiracies without conspiracy theories, theories being a certain framework, a set of assumptions about what that set of facts is about. So it's essentially a moral tale that eventually can play loose with the facts and arranges them in pre-existing patterns. Now, today, we're no longer in the 16th century, but today it's no longer legitimate to write in that way about facts. This has become this way of telling a story, of telling about, in fact, a story of absolute evil erupting in the political or social realm is no longer something we accept as legitimate. So what happened? Why did it become illegitimate? I think two things happened, and I'll glide quickly over them for the sake of time and have more time for the Q&A. The first happened in the 19th century. The idea that conspiracies were an effective way of explaining events became increasingly legitimate because of the birth of the modern state as something that was no longer personalized, as in the time of Lorenzo de' Medici, for instance, or the Roman oligarchy, but something entrenched, institutionalized, anonymous, with a powerful administration controlling its territory. And you increasingly see in the 19th century, in the literature, in the political literature, the assumption that it's no longer possible to conspire under modern conditions. This is a quote from a French dictionary of the mid-19th century. It's a fool's errand to conspire at a time when the press is more or less free, when the governments have at their disposal enormous budgets, immense armies, the telegraph, the postal services, and the ubiquitous gang of informers. All modern conspiracies have thus failed. So the idea that conspiracies no longer explain much because they're no longer possible. But the flip side of this is that if they become impossible under modern conditions because of the emergence of the modern state with its police and so on and so forth, the only entity left capable of conspiring is the state itself. And that's what a lot of opponents to the Ancien Régime tend to say, in particular liberals. The number one example here would be François Guilhot. He's a liberal politician of the 19th century in France, and he even wrote a pamphlet about conspiracy in 1821, in which he suggests that what we call conspiracies are nothing but conspiracy theories that weak and fearful states invent to crack down on their positions. So conspiracy become only theories because they're impossible, and they're invented by states to actually crack down on their position. That is, they are the outer shell, if you want, of a state conspiracy. It's almost the idea of the deep state in the making. And that too is an old idea. So that's the first thing that happens and makes the idea of conspiracy legitimate from a historical point of view. The second thing that happens closer to us, and it happens in 1948, and that's still where things stand today, I believe. It's the moment when conspiracy thinking really becomes illegitimate. It's also the moment when the concept of conspiracy theory is coined. It appears in 1948, and it's the work of this person here, who is a philosopher of science. Some of you might have heard about Karl Popper. He died not that long ago. And he coined at least the notion of conspiracy theory. We didn't have it before. And that already is telling us something about what happens then. It's the tail end of that process I described of drifting of that sort of way of telling history into the realm of full illegitimacy. What he called the conspiracy theory of society was, I quote him, the idea or the view that whatever happens in society, including things that people as a rule dislike, such as war, unemployment, poverty, shortages, are the results of direct design by some powerful individuals or group. And that could be the monopolists, the capitalists, the imperialists, the elders of Zion. I mean, you name it. That's the concept. Essentially, it's the idea that nothing happens casually, that every event, every social phenomenon of importance is the outcome of a decision taken somewhere by some powerful actor or group of powerful actors. Now, it's not that Popper says conspiracies don't exist. On the contrary, he says that we all spend our time colluding with each other, conspiring, if you want, in order to control our social environment. But because society is so complex, because we cannot calculate all the ripple effects of our actions and the way others and gazillions of other people will adjust their own behavior to that, we can never be sure that things will come out exactly as we intended them to. The point here is that society is so complex, at least societies where people act freely, is such a complex order that it cannot be manipulated to such an extent. Therefore, conspiracy theories are bad theories. They're bad social theories. We can't explain how the world works on the basis of conspiracy theories. That's the moment when really that notion becomes fully illegitimate. And that's the assumptions we have inherited. They're quite recent, as you can say. Now, one important caveat here is that there's one exception. Conspiracy theories they cannot explain social events in those societies that are free, but where societies are indeed controlled by a strong, central, absolute power. They're valid. So they're good theories of what happens in totalitarian societies. So you see, there's a kind of, what happens not immediately after the Second World War, there's a kind of divide. There's societies for which conspiracy are wrong theories, crackpot theories, but there are other societies for which actually they do offer a pretty good explanation of what goes on. Now, today, we don't talk about totalitarianism anymore, but we certainly would consider legitimate to talk about conspiracies in illiberal societies, say Russia or Iran or China. Think about the Russiagate, for instance. We don't look at ourselves as crackpot theorists because we talk about the capacity of Moscow to conspire. It's okay. What's not okay is to import these categories to our own liberal democratic societies. So we cannot, it's a divide. So our distinctions between real conspiracies, if you want, and conspiracy theories are premised on a number of inarticulate prior ideological and political assumptions. They're not absolute, and they evolve in history, which is what I've tried to show you. Now, let me move on to my last point, and it speaks to something that Lisa said in her introduction about deep-seated cultural template. Popper had another way. He came up with another definition of conspiracy theories. He wrote that they were the typical result of the secularization of religious superstitions. He saw them almost as a leftover of a previous era in which it was okay to believe that what happened in the world was essentially reflecting some divine, God-ordained decision coming down from Mount Olympus or something else. So he saw the powerful forces that supposedly at work in any conspiracy theories. He compared that to ancient gods. Now, without going back to paganism or even to antiquity, I want to draw your attention to the fact that indeed conspiracy theories are very often grafted onto a religious script. And when it comes to their affinities with religion, there is one master narrative about conspiracy theories that you can find very often, if not directly and explicitly, at least just lying under the surface. And that's the narrative that revolves around this figure, which is the Antichrist. You could actually write a history of conspiracy theories revolving around that figure of the Antichrist. In fact, Norman Cohn, a British historian, did something like this in the 60s. Now, it's a figure that emerges in the theology of the first century of our era, in Paul's letter, in the book of John, in the Apocalypse. And you can see in those texts references to a figure that will try to deceive people by pretending to be the Lord. In fact, here I took a picture from a fresco in Orvieto by Signorelli, which is brilliant because you can see how the Antichrist looks like the Christ, but it has a much darker representation and figure. And what I find is brilliant is this kind of optical illusion. You're not sure whether it's his arm or the devil's is actually controlling him as a puppeteer of sorts. And so it's a figure who deceives people by pretending to be the Lord, pretending to unify mankind into the realm, only to be unmasked and eventually defeated during the day of judgment. So you have to think of him as the first false flag operation, we would say today, or the first crisis actor. That's who the Antichrist is. It's the idea that history is there's a world historical imposture going on in history that will be revealed at the end times. And the Antichrist has a tremendous literary fortune and career as a figure of conspiracy theories. This is a caricature of the second half of the 19th century representing Napoleon III as the Antichrist, as the beast, and the French Third Empire probably as the last empire. This Veliki of Malyam is the Great with the Small, is the first by Sergei Nilus, who's a Russian mystic. That's a translation, that's a publication from 1903, is the first book in which the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, was published for the first time as an appendix to this treatise, which is a treatise about the Antichrist. The subtitle is The Antichrist and Imminent Political Possibility. That's the bestseller by Pat Robertson of the early 90s that presents the post-89 world as indeed the last empire and the world of the Antichrist. And this is a 2013 poll that is mentioned in The Guardian, which says that 1 in 4 Americans think Obama might be the Antichrist. So see, a tremendously important figure in conspiracy theories. And in fact, if you look at QAnon, and if you take off the meat and look at really at the bones of the story, what do you have? You have an absolute evil masquerading under the facade of benevolence. You have the pretense of unifying mankind. That's, the globalist aspect. And the idea that these people will be rounded up in an operation called the Storm, which is essentially a last judgment. It is a secular apocalypse. Once So why am I pointing at these affinities? First of all, the idea is poppers, really. I'm just taking it a bit further. But is that once you realize that conspiracy theories are piggybacking often on very powerful and deeply entrenched cultural narratives, you run into a problem. Because if you want to debunk conspiracy theories, how far do you go? Where do you draw the line, really? I mean, conspiracy theories are like pornography. You know it when you see it, but it's basically impossible to define, because if you do define it, then you run into real conundrums. Are you going to debunk the Book of John? Are you going to debunk, why not, the Gospels or Paul's letter? I mean, how far do you go? In fact, in a way, the Enlightenment tried to do this and it didn't work. So I think this draws our attention to one aspect of conspiracy theories, which the current approaches, which are very much focused on information, cognition, and so on and so forth, may have neglected. We tend to look at them as false information, something that may be true or false, and is usually false. But if you think about them through the lens of religious analogies, religious truth is of a different order. It's imperious to logic or science. In fact, you keep believing in it in the face of repeated disconfirmation. That's really what defines faith. And if you look at conspiracy theories as something analogous to some secularized form of religion, then you realize why debunking is such a hard thing to nail down, and maybe an impossible or endless task. And I think there might be something like that at play in conspiracy theories today. The question is not so much what they say, but why, and why do they have so much traction at some point in history, while at other moments they are around, but they simply don't matter at all. And especially, why today do they seem to replace politics in certain areas of social life? Why do they almost take the place of political ideologies? I mean, think about the neologism conspiracism. It's built, as fascism or socialism. It's almost like an ideology of sorts. And here I don't have answers to these questions, but I think they're important to ask. And it may be that people find in them not just a theory, but a sense of community. Think about QAnon chapters, a rationalization of feelings of powerlessness, or rationalization of the anxious sentiment that we might have reached the end of history, if not maybe the end times. And I think if that's what's at play in conspiracy theories, technical solutions or information-based solutions can only do that much. And we might maybe want to think about what could be a more powerful answer. And that answer would probably take a more political form rather than, I guess, a technical one. But I think I'm exhausted my time, and I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to discussion with you or questions. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm also glad to be here, and I'm very glad that I am the second speaker now, because certain things were already said, so I can maybe try not to use up all my time for the presentation, seeing how many questions there were after the first talk, and we may be able then to pick up some of them even after my talk. Though there might be new ones. Then I'm sharing my screen, which you should be able to see now. And I want to begin, although I share a lot of Nicolas' reservations about defining conspiracy theory, with a definition nevertheless. So when I speak of conspiracy theories in the following, I think of ideas, narratives that, according to the political scientist Michael Barkun, share three major assumptions. Conspiracy theories usually assume that nothing happens by accident. They assume that there is a group of evil agents, the conspirators, who have not only planned everything that is happening, but who are also able to put these plans into practice, to realize their plans over not only a couple of hours or days, but weeks, months, years, sometimes decades. So history really can be controlled, politics really can be controlled and orchestrated. That's the major assumption that conspiracy theories make. Closely connected to that is the assumption that nothing is as it seems. The really important things conspiracy theories claim happen in secret. The conspirators are not operating openly, but they are cloaking what they are doing, and you always have to unveil what's happening. You have to pull back the curtain in order to realize what's really going on. And if you do that, you realize that everything is connected, that there are links between people, events, and institutions that you would never have thought possible, and that only makes sense if you assume that there is a large-scale plot going on. For example, there are conspiracy theories about COVID that assume that the 5G technology is either responsible for the existence of the coronavirus or for the disease COVID-19, which is generally and falsely attributed to a virus. So things that have nothing to do with each other come together and make sense from a conspiracist point of view. Since there was a question in the chat if conspiracy theories should really be called theories, we see by looking at these three assumptions already that conspiracy theories indeed are theories at the end of the day. Because what are theories? If you ask analytical philosophers, those who are most precise when it comes to defining terms and concepts, theories are sets of related assumptions that try to generate knowledge about the world. That doesn't mean that these assumptions need to make sense. It doesn't mean that they need to generate accurate knowledge about the world, but we have a set of assumptions and the attempt to understand the world. And this is what conspiracy theories, I think, are very much about at the end of the day. I think it's also important maybe at this point to stress that conspiracy theories and disinformation are usually and very often two different things. On the one hand, not every piece of disinformation that is an intentional falsehood that is put out there posits a hidden plot and a conspiracy. And on the other hand, many people who spread conspiracy theories, most people I would say indeed, actually believe that what they are saying is true. They don't think that they are putting out false information. They think that they are putting out the correct information. Of course, in practice these days, whenever we're faced with conspiracy theories spreading online, going viral, it's usually a combination of both. We have actors that are spreading them very cynically for disinformation, and we have those that spread them because they really think that they are doing humanity a service. Now, this book by Barkun is also interesting if you are interested in the relationship between religion and conspiracy theory, because as you see, the subtitle is Apocalyptic Visions in Contemporary America. That's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is that for Barkun, conspiracy theories are a form of stigmatized knowledge. They are not a form of legitimate knowledge that is put out by academics, by established politicians, but they are a form of counter knowledge, a subjugated knowledge, to speak with Foucault. And conspiracy theories, therefore, are usually counter narratives to an official version of events, which they question, critique, and challenge. And this is how scholarship has for a long time thought about conspiracy theories. And 20 years ago, there was the observation, especially with regard to American culture, that conspiracy theories were maybe shedding some of that stigmatization, that they were moving more into the mainstream. So to quote from two very important studies in cultural studies, Tim Melley writing in 2000 in Empire of Conspiracy, conspiracy theory has a long history in the United States, but its influence has never been greater than now. And quite similarly, a year later, Peter Knight wrote in Conspiracy Culture, conspiracy theories have become far more prominent, no longer the favorite rhetoric of backwater scaremongers, but the lingua franca of many ordinary Americans. So the idea of scholarship back then was that conspiracy theories were shedding their stigma in American culture, that they were becoming more and more mainstream. However, we know by now, or many scholars assume by now, and I'm one of them, that the story actually needs to be told exactly the opposite way. at least with regard to the time until maybe 2010. So conspiracy theories are not an anthropological given. As far as we know, we don't find conspiracy theories in all times and at all places. We do find them in antiquity, in the ancient Greek city-states, and also in ancient Rome. But then they disappear for a long while, and they only emerge in fully fledged versions again during the early modern period, in the early 16th century. And from then on, as we know by now from a lot of historical scholarship, among others by people like Nicolas, they were what the sociology of knowledge would call orthodox knowledge, actually until the second half of the 20th century. They were not counter-narratives, they were the official versions of events. They were not believed throughout the Western world by a minority of people, but by the majority, by ordinary people and by politicians, by scientists, by religious and intellectual leaders. People thought that this is how the world worked. And it's only during the 50s and 60s, and Nicolas already talked about Popper, that conspiracy theories move from the mainstream to the margins of society and stop being orthodox knowledge and become heterodox, stigmatized, subjugated knowledge, knowledge that is no longer commonly accepted, but that is considered problematic and that is usually only believed by a minority. This is what happens in American culture. This is what happens in most of Europe. But as we will see in my talk later, this has not happened all over the world. It has not happened in all European countries, as far as we know, especially not in Eastern European countries, and not in some countries and regions outside of what we usually call the Western world. And this, of course, has implications for transnational campaigns to counter conspiracy theories. And this is where this historical narrative that I will be unfolding in the next 20 minutes will ultimately lead to. So, from the 16th century until the 1960s, we could say, people weren't really concerned about conspiracy theories and their harmful effects on society and democracy, but they were concerned about conspiracies, about real plots and how they might abolish democracy, how they might harm society. And I can tell you from my research in American history that basically every American president, from George Washington in the 1790s to Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s, believed in and spread conspiracy theories. Washington did this, Thomas Jefferson did this, John Adams did this. The American Declaration of Independence is completely unintelligible if you don't see the conspiracy theories in the background. And someone who also did it is Abraham Lincoln, because the Civil War, historians have long established, would not have happened without the existence of widespread and largely accepted conspiracy theories on both sides of the conflict. And in one of his most famous speeches, his 1858 House Divided speech, Abraham Lincoln accused a number of leading Democratic politicians of conspiring against the American nation. This is the quote from that speech that you may not be familiar with, where he says, "We cannot know absolutely for sure that all of these adaptations are the result of preconcept. But when we see a lot of framed timber," so he's using this metaphor of the house, "different portions of which we know have been gotten out at different times and places and by different workmen, Stephen, Franklin, Roger, and James, for instance." These are his workman examples. And when we see these timbers joined together and they exactly make the frame of a house or a mill, all the tenons and mortises exactly fitting and all the lengths and proportions of the different pieces exactly adapted to their respective places, and not a piece too many or too few, not omitting even scaffolding, or if a single piece be lacking, we can see the place in the frame exactly fitted and prepared to yet bring in such piece. In such a case, we find it impossible not to believe that Stephen and Franklin and Roger and James all understood one another from the beginning and all worked upon a common plan or draft drawn up before the first lick was struck. So he says, if people are doing all these different things, putting all these different pieces of timber together, and it begins to form a perfect house, then they must have been working on a common plan. And he claims that this explains what happened during the 1850s, when people were saying very different things about slavery, and different institutions were taking different steps. But for him, this is all coming together in the direction that slavery will soon be legal all over the United States, and that even the white working class might be in danger of being enslaved for its own good, because there really were discussions like that at the time. So, but why is he talking about Stephen Franklin, Roger, and James? Because the conspirators that he identifies are Stephen Douglas, his opponent in the senatorial race in Illinois at the time, of which this speech is part, Roger Taney, the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court, who wrote the majority decision in a very famous court case in the 1850s that enhanced the course of the pro-slavery faction, the former President Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, the current president. So in other words, Lincoln is claiming that these are the masterminds behind a conspiracy by the so-called slave power, whose ultimate goal it is to make slavery legal everywhere in the United States. And he claims that this conspiracy is currently controlling all branches of government. It is controlling the Supreme Court because Taney is in on it. It is controlling the White House because Pierce and Buchanan are in on it, and it is controlling Congress, where Douglas is one of the most important figures. If you think, okay, maybe Lincoln is an exception, fast forward to a different country and to a different renowned statesman, Winston Churchill, who during the 1920s delivers a number of extremely anti-Semitic speeches. So this is from his speech Zionism versus Bolshevism from the 1920s, where he basically makes a distinction between two types of Jews. So the context he's thinking about conspiracy is, of course, the Russian Revolution, which he sees as both a communist plot and, as we see in this text, also a Zionist plot. So, or let's say not Zionist, but Jewish plot, because he makes a distinction very clearly cut in this speech between two types of Jews. He says, on the one hand, there are the good Jews, the Jews who identify with the countries that have taken them in or who want to establish their own national home in Palestine. And on the other hand, there are the bad Jews, the international Marxist Jews, who are conspiring to bring all governments of the world under their control. And he says, the adherents of the sinister confederacy are mostly men reared up among the unhappy populations of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. Most, if not all of them, have forsaken the faith of their forefathers and divorced from their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, Bella Kuhn, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played, as a modern writer, Mrs. Webster has so ably shown, a definitely recognizable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire. So what Churchill is doing here is that he constructs a large historical narrative that goes back to the 18th century. And he even turns Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Order of the Illuminati, a professor of theology at the University of Ingolstadt in the 18th century, into a Jew. The guy was a Catholic, in order to link the Illuminati, this secret order that you probably have heard about, to this Jewish conspiracy. And he claims that basically Jewish conspirators are responsible for all successful or failed revolutions throughout the 19th century. And what's the source for that? It's Mrs. Webster, Helen Nestor Webster, an English aristocrat who first wrote novels about the French Revolution and then began to develop conspiracy theories about the French Revolution. And then in the next step was the first one, as far as we know, to develop conspiracy theories where the Illuminati, the Jews, and the communists were all working together in secret. And for Churchill, arguably the most important British statesman of the 20th century, she was a reliable source, as she was for many of his contemporaries in England and throughout the Western world, because it was just so normal to believe in conspiracy theories and to base policies on conspiracy theories. Not stigmatized at all at that time. However, and this is something that I can only glance at, the status of conspiracy theories changes during the 1950s and 60s. We understand that in detail for the United States because of the book by Katharina Thalmann that you see here, and we can assume that similar factors were at work in Germany, in France, in Scandinavia, and in other European countries. Nicolas, in a way, has already talked about that, so let me just add a little bit to that. What Thalmann argues is that there's basically two directions from which conspiracy theories were problematized in the 40s and 50s, and that then gained a certain cultural momentum in the 1960s. One is the school around Popper, which argues conspiracy theories are bad explanations of social processes. The second one is the Frankfurt School. The emigres of the Frankfurt School are in exile in the United States, and they are looking to what is happening in Europe, and they see how a specific conspiracy theory, that of the Jewish Marxist world conspiracy, is leading to genocide, to the Holocaust. And based on that observation, they developed the argument that conspiracy theories are always dangerous, that conspiracy theories are anti-democratic, that conspiracy theories are tied to extremism, authoritarianism, and populism. And together, these two critiques of conspiracy theory slowly, by way of a popularization of the insights from the social sciences, enter the social mainstream in the 1950s. Conspiracy theories get less and less accepted in the second half of the 1950s in the United States. They really travel to the margins, which then allows a third generation of scholars to really cast them as an element of political extremism. And you see on the slide there in the third column this article that you might know if you know any article about conspiracy theories, Hofstadter's Paranoid Style in American Politics, which was also already mentioned earlier. And what Thalmann's narrative shows is that this article is in many ways the end point of a development of the stigmatization of conspiracy theories, not in any way the starting point. So what does this stigmatization lead to? It leads to the situation that we are in at the very moment, that people really worry about conspiracy theories now and their harmful effects on society and democracy, and no longer about the impact of conspiracies. Conspiracy theories now really are in the Western world a form of stigmatized knowledge, and even quantitative research in the political sciences bears out this claim that conspiracy theories have become less influential over the course of the 20th century in US culture, for example. Joe Oshinsky and Joe Parent write in their 2014 study on American conspiracy theories, the data suggest one telling fact: we do not live in an age of conspiracy theories and have not for some time, and they also see the shifting point in the 1960s. However, now you could say, of course, that was 2014. A lot of things have happened before since 2014. And that is true. For once, how do we think about conspiracy theories if the American president, and now the former American president, spreads them, if they are part of what you get on certain American television channels each night as part of your evening news? Now, the United States is a very complex country in that regard. There are certain things in movement, and to give you just my short take as an Americanist, I think that democracy in the US really is in danger, and one of the reasons why it is because of conspiracy theories and the way the Republican Party has embraced the conspiracy theory of the stolen election. Now, we're focusing more on an EU level here, so the question that arises from that then is that if conspiracy theories are maybe less stigmatized or completely destigmatized in certain parts of the American public, how do you position yourself with regard to the United States as individual European countries or the EU, if there are people back in power maybe in 2024 that openly promote conspiracy theories, that do not condemn conspiracy theories, that base their own policies on conspiracy theories? Moreover, and this is the second and I think to me more important part of this, however, as we know quite well by now, this process of stigmatization of conspiracy theories was more or less restricted to what we commonly refer to as the Western world. Outside of the Western world, it didn't really happen, or it happened only to a very limited degree. which explains why, for example, people like Ahmadinejad, the former Iranian president, would constantly deploy conspiracy theories to explain anything evil that was happening inside the country as a Zionist American plot, from droughts, because the Americans were basically keeping the clouds from getting to Iran, to uprisings. And we see the same pattern at the moment with how the regime is dealing with the protests that have been going on for some while. And that's quite typical. I co-edited a volume on conspiracy theories in the US and the Middle East a couple of years ago. And one of the major takeaways there is conspiracy theories function completely differently in the Middle East, in the Arab world, and more generally also than in the Muslim world. But we don't even have to leave Europe to see conspiracy theories function differently. We can also look to Eastern Europe. Now, when Vladimir Putin justified the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February a year ago, I first read that speech and I thought, oh yeah, he's using really a lot of conspiracy theories to do that. And my initial hunch was to say, well, I mean, this is just mere propaganda, because he can't be believing many of these things themselves. However, seeing how the invasion first went and how Putin and many members of his inner circle obviously expected that Russian troops would be welcomed with open arms, at least in certain parts of Ukraine, it seems that he was not only doing this cynically, but that he was believing at least some of these conspiracy theories himself, which is not that surprising, because we know from a number of studies that conspiracy theories are a perfectly acceptable form of knowledge in Russia, and have been for a very long time. And we can move even closer to home, and we can think about inside of the European Union. One of the things that I'm doing is that I'm directing a project that is funded by the European Research Council on populism and conspiracy theories. And what we do is that we look at different European countries, and we look at the political discourse there, we look at the online discourse, but we also do ethnographic fieldwork. And I have a PhD student who is a graduate of the Central European University, a political scientist, who is working on Hungary. And one of the things that has quite clearly emerged from her research is that conspiracy theories are absolutely hegemonic in Hungary. That doesn't mean that everybody believes in them. There is a considerable liberal opposition that doesn't really believe in these conspiracy theories, but there are also parts of the opposition that counters the Fidesz party's conspiracy theories with their own conspiracy theories. And of course, Viktor Orban, whom you see on the image, and his Fidesz party have been employing conspiracy theories targeting George Soros, the EU, and many others for a decade now, systematically, to get their policies through and to transform the Hungarian state. And it's not the case that they're doing this only cynically and that only the unenlightened masses of their voters are believing that, but there are clear indicators, and that also transpires in the interviews with Fidesz politicians that my PhD student did, that many party officials, maybe by now even Orban himself, believe these conspiracy theories. So what we are faced with then is a situation both globally, but also even with inside of the European Union, where conspiracy theories are thought about in very different ways in different countries, and where they enjoy a very different status in different countries. And dealing with conspiracy theories needs to take this into account, because one-size-fits-all campaigns are not going to be very successful. And that's the major consequence, I think, of why I'm unfolding this historical narrative here for you today and pointing you to the cultural and regional differences. In the summer of 2020, for example, I advised the European Commission and UNESCO on a campaign where infographics about conspiracy theories were produced. The campaign was called Think Before Sharing. And as you can see, this was originally done in English, and then it was translated into French and all kinds of other languages, including Chinese. And the idea was that we can basically alert people to the dangers and the falsehoods of conspiracy theories everywhere in the world by just giving them the same information. As I said, and this is why I'm using this example, I was complicit in that. I took part in that. I already had qualms about that back then, but I thought, well, maybe better that than nothing, because obviously I think this campaign was not very successful for two reasons. On the one hand, if you want to reach convinced conspiracy theorists, even in countries where conspiracy theories are stigmatized, just pointing out the dangers of conspiracy theories and correcting certain basic misconceptions is not going to work. So debunking and fact-checking is not going to do a lot of good for people who truly believe in conspiracy theories. Why is that? Because especially in countries where conspiracy theories are stigmatized and where it is not normal to believe in them, the identities, the self-images of those who believe in them nevertheless are closely tied to these conspiracy theories. And if you attack the conspiracy theories, you attack their self-images, which is why they employ strategies of immunization to not listen to the facts and might even believe in their conspiracy theories more after you have presented them with convincing counter-evidence. Therefore, debunking is extremely problematic. It works for people who don't have a fixed opinion yet, who might find conspiracy theories or certain ones appealing, but aren't really convinced by them yet. It works obviously as a means to confirm the positions of those who see them skeptical anyway, but it doesn't work for those people who are already convinced by them. It's extremely difficult and painful and slow to get these people to get rid of their beliefs if you are ever successful. And it only works if you have a personal relationship to them usually. However, what is more successful is pre-bunking, or as scholars sometimes refer to it quite problematically, inoculation. We know from empirical studies, but also from the experience that I have, for example, with work training teachers of English for many years and going to schools a lot, that if you educate people about what conspiracy theories are, how they work and how they argue, then they are much less likely to believe in them later when they encounter them, so to say, in the wild. But the second reason why this campaign wasn't very successful is that conspiracy theories function differently in different regions of the world. They enjoy a very different status there. And for example, if you assume, as this campaign assumed, that conspiracy theories are going to challenge official versions of events, that is not going to work in Russia or in China or in many other places, even inside the EU, for the reasons that I have outlined. And therefore, what we need, I think, is a much better understanding of how conspiracy theories work in different European regions and countries, how accepted they are there, and what effects that has. And then whenever we want to think about campaigns on the EU level, for example, or a global level to counter conspiracy theories, we have to customize these campaigns. One size fits all is not going to work. Now, luckily, and that is my final slide, a project that is at least trying to do some of this is already on the way, and that is the REDACT project, which is funded by CHANS. REDACT stands for Researching Europe, Digitalization and Conspiracy Theories, and what we are doing in this project is that we are looking at conspiracy theories in different European regions, for example, in the Balkans, in the Baltics, in Slovakia and Poland, in the UK and in the German-speaking countries. And we want to find out how conspiracy theories work there, how digitalization has had an impact on these conspiracy theories, and how online talk might translate under which conditions into real-world protests and even violence. And one of the questions that we are asking is, how accepted are conspiracy theories in these different regions? And one of the outcomes of the project in which we are working closely together with stakeholders is to then really also make recommendations that are specifically geared at these specific regions with regard to how to counter conspiracy theories there and how to address them for the publics there. I saw earlier when I looked through the list of participants that our project leader, Claire Birchall, is among the guests here today. And I think she would also be a great speaker in a future session to talk about some of the results of the projects once we have generated them. I stop here and I look very much forward to your questions, and I thank you for your attention.